Welcome back to C2C Journal. Today we're exploring a high-profile legal battle between a group of students and the Ontario government. The case, Mather v. Ontario, argues that the province's 2030 emission target is too weak and violates the youth charter rights to life, security, and equality. Joining us here today is C2C author and retired litigation lawyer Andrew Roman, who takes a closer look at this case and concludes the lawsuit rests on shaky legal and scientific footing. Let's unpack the case, the claims, and why Roman believes climate policy belongs in the political arena, not in the courtroom. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you here today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Of course. So let's dive into it. So for those who are unfamiliar with the case, can you provide an overview of what this case is all about?
Sure. So there are 7 children and young people, some of whom are Indigenous. They are challenging Ontario's law that lowered the targets for greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and by 2050. Their claim is that Ontario's lower target will cause a dangerous level of climate change in Ontario, and they wanted the judge to force the province to increase that target, not just back to the previous level, but even higher. Now, this case is not being run like the usual lawsuit where there's a plaintiff suing for damages. This is different because it's an application. It's not a lawsuit. There's no money damages involved. So the children are called applicants, not plaintiffs. And the government of Ontario is called the respondent, not the defendants. Now, the judge that heard the application initially was supportive of the applicant's position. I'll just give you a brief quote from her reasons for decision. She said this, quote, "By not taking steps to reduce greenhouse gases in the province further, Ontario is contributing to an increase in the risk of death and the risks faced by the applicants and others with respect to security of the person," close quote. So she was very much in favor of these remarkable youths, as she called them, but in the end, she threw out the application. She accepted the Ontario government's argument that this was something called a, quote, positive rights case. That means that they were trying to compel Ontario to do something positive that it would not otherwise do, rather than preventing Ontario from doing something negative. So the case was lost initially, and the children didn't like the case, and they appealed. The Court of Appeal then overruled the judge. They held that because Ontario volunteered or voluntarily legislated a target, by doing so, it assumed the responsibility for ensuring that its legislation, just like all legislation, was compliant with the Charter of Rights. So that's what the case is about.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely lots to unpack here. So in terms of the Charter of Rights, the students claim that the emissions violates their charter. What specific parts of the charter do they claim that these emission targets violate?
Well, the first part is Section 7, which covers the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. And the claim was that climate change will affect them much longer in the future because they're much younger. Also, they were complaining under Section 15 that their right to freedom from discrimination was being violated because they said that climate change is worse for youth and for Indigenous youth than the rest of the population, such as people my age who won't be around as long as they will be.
Interesting. So here in your essay, you highlight two main issues with this case. The first one being the legal framework, and the second, the scientific basis. So first, can you explain the problems with the legal arguments used by the applicants?
Yeah, the legal argument is based on a legal assumption that's clearly wrong. They assume that the danger of climate change in Ontario is caused by the province's own emissions target, so that if the court grants the order that they want, that will reduce those dangers. But climate change is not provincial, it's planetary. Global warming is global, not just in Ontario. And there's no benefit to the applicants if the court grants what they want, because it's not within the power of Ontario to prevent climate change or even to measurably reduce the effects of climate change within the province of Ontario. And there's an old legal principle, centuries old, that a court should not make an order or declaration that will serve no useful purpose. And what the applicants are seeking here, if it was granted, would serve no useful purpose. The other side of this same problem is that there's no causal connection between Ontario's own emissions and any risk to the life and security of the applicants. And that's what makes their charter argument irrelevant. Here's some numbers. Canada emits 1.5% of total global greenhouse gas emissions. So that means the other 98.5% comes from everywhere else around the planet. And that's Canada. Now, when you look at Ontario, zoom in to Ontario, emits only around 22% of Canada's total. So that means that Ontario emits 0.3% of global emissions. And that also means that 99.9% comes from outside Ontario. So close to 100% comes from outside Ontario. Now, when you look at the accuracy with which emissions are measured, it's only plus or minus 15%. So we can't measure with very great accuracy. And that's why if tomorrow Ontario disappeared off the surface of the planet, our little 0.3% would not change the climate measurably in Ontario or anywhere else on Earth. And that's why the applicants are asking the court to ask Ontario, force Ontario to do something that it can't do, which is to fix the climate.
Exactly.
So let's get back to the law.
Mhm.
Canada's charter only applies in Canada, and the Ontario court's authority only applies in Ontario. So an Ontario court can't make any order that would change or affect the 99.7% of global emissions that come from outside Ontario.
Mhm.
And so they're asking the Ontario government to do something it can't do. And that's a waste of time. The purpose of a court is not theater. The purpose of a court is to make decisions that have a useful purpose.
Absolutely. You also talk in your essay about this concept of the CO2 wall fallacy. Can you explain what that means to those who haven't read your essay?
Yeah, the legal arguments that the applicants made were based on factual arguments and evidence that was just plain wrong. One of the major errors, rather, was the assumption that there was like a CO2 dome over the province of Ontario, which held Ontario's CO2 emissions in and everyone else's emissions out. That was necessary for the legal argument that Ontario controlled Ontario's climate. But obviously, there's nothing above Ontario that keeps the emissions in and those from the rest of the world out. So when you expose that error, it becomes clear that the province can't control its climate any more than it can control the climate of the rest of the planet. Now, another incorrect assumption, which is very serious, is that we could have a scientist come in and tell the court that CO2 emissions targets should be scientific. But these targets are political. And let me explain why. It's because implementing any target requires policies like having a carbon tax or having emissions caps or carbon budgets. These things are, as you know from the carbon tax, what it did to your gas prices, these things are costly to comply with. And those costs are ultimately paid for by consumers through higher prices for goods and services. That's also called inflation. And that's what these policies can do. So, how much more the cost of living should be in Canada is not a scientific question. Look at it this way. Shortly after Mark Carney took over the Canadian government, he reduced the consumer carbon tax to zero, and that was clearly a political decision. I say that that's also true of any change in the carbon budget or the emissions targets. They're political and they're not judicial.
Absolutely. In your view, why was Ontario's defense in court inadequate and what should they have done differently?
Well, the defense didn't really effectively challenge the applicant's expert evidence on scientists, as I just mentioned, or also on their main legal arguments. It focused its defense on the legal technicality, that positive negative rights argument that I mentioned earlier. And that technicality worked until it didn't when it got to the Court of Appeal.
Right.
So I have to wonder, the Ontario AG or Attorney General has a constitutional law group within it, which has excellent lawyers. But why do they not challenge this CO2 dome thing more successfully? I think that the lawyers were probably instructed or they were expected to be politically cautious. What this means in today's political climate is that if you disagree from the story that there's a climate crisis, which is going to make the planet boil in a few years' time, that's met with accusations of your being a climate denialist. And that's politically unpopular. So the provincial lawyers, I think, had to restrain themselves in making more effective arguments. And the effect of that is that it's like a decision that says, let's lose on technical grounds rather than let's win on politically unpopular arguments. It's like self-censorship, and it shouldn't be happening. So they should have used more scientific evidence, including obviously challenging the glass dome assumption and demonstrating that setting affordable targets is political rather than scientific. In Ontario and throughout North America, there are numerous scientific and economic experts, some of the best in the world, who could have testified on these matters if the provincial lawyers had brought them in to do that. And I hope next time around they do that. Now, that concludes my argument on that question, but I think you had another question.
Well, my next question was about where this case currently stands. But if you want to talk about anything else in terms of this case in regards to the science, based arguments or anything like that, please feel free to talk about those things as well.
Well, I don't know exactly where it stands because I'm not one of the lawyers in the case, but I know that there will be a new hearing because the Court of Appeal said there would be, and it will take months to prepare for it and months for the hearing to be conducted and concluded.
Hmm.
So I'm hoping that this time around, the province's legal team will be better supported by expert witnesses and let the lawyers make the response that they should make, even if it's controversial.
Hmm. Absolutely. In your opinion, what are the broader risks if courts start dictating climate policy, as in this case?
The broader risk is that the court will make the wrong decision, which will cause severe social and economic damage to the province. And some of the people damaged would be the same age as these applicants. That's because um, there's something called the law of unintended consequences, where if you raise a target, that will have unintended consequences that a court is really unable to assess. Uh, a court is not a royal commission that will sit for years and study a question. It'll listen to the evidence and then it's all over. Now, a higher target will undoubtedly create higher costs, and those would disproportionately harm people on fixed and low incomes who also have charter rights, by the way, not just these children. And that would make it also more difficult for young people like the plaintiffs to get their first jobs when there is higher unemployment. Now, if Ontario raises its targets in response to a judicial decision, and if these applicants or other applicants still don't like these increased targets, they'll come back to court again and they'll say to the court, fix it.
Hmm.
And so what will tend to happen is that the court, rather than the elected government, becomes the regulator for Ontario's emissions targets. And what's worse is that they'll be using the Charter of Rights to do that. The Charter of Rights is not designed to do that. It focuses on personal rights, yours and mine and everyone else's, but they can't judge the costliness of provincial emissions targets. And these targets are not just provincial, but they must be considered within Canada's policies. So, for example, if we have a carbon tax or other climate policies for Canada, then that affects Ontario. And so even if Ontario had no target, the carbon tax would still work in Ontario. And that's what the court can't figure out, whether these targets are likely to be achieved, at what cost, and to whom. Those are things the courts are not well equipped to do, and the charter doesn't equip them to do it.
Absolutely. So your argument is that keep the courts for human rights issues and keep climate policy for the political realm.
That's exactly right.
And finally, what is the key message or main takeaway you want our readers to come away with from this essay and from our discussion today?
Well, I'd like them to realize that, for example, China, which is responsible for more than 30% of the global emissions, is getting those emissions from burning coal. And it's building something like two new coal plants every week, about 100 per year. And those emissions flow over Ontario as well as everywhere else. So Ontario has and never had any legal duty to put its emissions targets into a law.
Hmm.
It could just say, here's our policy. When it legislates these targets in order to feel good and look good, it just makes the province a target for litigation.
Hmm.
So, uh, if this new hearing gives these applicants what they want, that would politically and effectively require Ontario to set a higher target. And that target is one that right now the Ontario government considers too high. So the obvious solution is for Ontario to repeal its law, to remove the bullseye off its back, basically. And that would remove Ontario's voluntary assumption, as the Court of Appeal called it, and that would mean that there's no legislation that would be required to be charter compliant. So judges and crown lawyers, like the rest of us, feel pressure to save the planet, as they say. And it's difficult to deny this story and to refuse the demands of idealistic children, young people.
Hmm.
But that's not a mature response for Ontario. So I'm suggesting it should just repeal the legislation and end the matter and stop virtue signaling about how good we are here in Ontario. If it doesn't do that, then the other thing it should do is use expert evidence to demonstrate the numerous fatal flaws in the applicant's case. I hope that your viewers get that message and they will find out how to get that in detail by reading the article.
Of course. I mean, well said, Andrew. Thank you so much for sharing your valuable insights today on the delicate balance between climate change policy and the role of the courts. For a full breakdown, be sure to check out the full article, The Children's Lawsuit Against Ontario's CO2 Emission Targets, linked down in the description below. To everybody tuning in, thank you so much for joining us. And again, Andrew, thank you so much. It was lovely to have you.
Thank you very much. Bye for now.